So integrated business planning and execution. You've most probably all heard about integrated business planning. I'm going to add the execution portion on and just explain why it's there and what its function is. First, traditional Oracle safe harbor stage. Okay, so some points to discuss first before we get there. Supply chain planning, or supply chain as a whole, in the past used to behave itself a lot more than it does now. We've heard discussed quite a few times this morning that supply chain and disruptions are becoming much more prevalent. So in the past, supply chains used to do what they were supposed to do: right product, right place, right time, without generating much attention. It always made it a bit more complicated for us as Oracle to sell supply chain planning or supply chain, because not everyone wanted to hear about it. Nowadays, everyone wants to hear about it because it's having a huge impact. So, from COVID to Ukraine now as well, even lately the baby formula shortages in the US. Okay, so first of all, focus on what is the problem we're trying to solve. So I've got a couple of percentages up here. The first one I want to focus on is the 28% from Oliver White. So Oliver White did research and confirmed that 28% of the executives that they interviewed, when they came to making assumptions, had nothing specific that they could take from those assumptions to something that they could execute. So that's challenge number one. McKinsey and Company did another research and found that 37% of those executives felt that the decisions that they were making didn't have the right quality and also the right velocity. So when I talk about velocity in terms of how quickly they could execute those plans. Bain and Company did more research where they felt that 40% of the strategy was lost when it comes to execution. So the sad part is that they found that even in the perfect conditions, where you have alignment across your entire supply chain, everyone agrees the right number, and you're all on the right track, 40% of the value is then lost when it comes down to executing. And then lastly, Oliver White did other research where we find that 60% of the companies that they interviewed found that when we come to our integrated business planning at a monthly level, 60% had no alignment between the move from monthly down to the weekly, so down to the execution. So this tells me two things. One is that a lot of value, a lot of effort is put into our strategy, but a lot of value is lost when it comes down to actually executing, getting to that execution portion. And then also around the velocity. So that is my next topic is this concept of decision latency. So some research was done a while ago on this topic. And essentially, lots of lines and numbers and things, but essentially all this is telling me is that if I can predict an event is going to happen, by the time the event has happened to how quickly I can actually react to that event, a lot of value is lost. And the longer it takes me to actually execute in terms of my change of my plans to actually execute that change in the plan, more value is lost. And you've heard this a couple of times this morning already, or this afternoon already. It's around how quickly can I execute? I know that there are going to be lots of disruptions coming, but how quickly can I execute? Okay, so two things. One, we know about the lost value in terms of from strategy down to execution, and now we also know about how quickly can we execute. So how can we? So what we've come up with at Oracle is this concept called IBPX, and I'll get more detail a bit later around what is the X portion. But essentially what we're wanting to do is create an alignment, a closed loop process between the planning portion. And here I'm talking not only just about supply chain planning, we're talking about financial planning as well. All your strategy, your simulations, but then also down to an execute phase, so linking the strategy down to an executable portion, and we'll get into the detail of how it does that later. But then also the using technologies like Internet of Things, AI, machine learning, to actually automate that process, so we can actually start predicting when things are going to be failing and account for them. Okay, so how is this really different to what's been done before? Well, not a lot, and before all the naysayers among the room say, well, I can see IBP and I can see S&OP in the same process. How is that? Certainly isn't IBP an evolution of S&OP? The answer is yes and no, and it depends on who you speak to. So essentially, when we term integrated business planning, it's my long-term strategy. It's my strategic vision of where the company is going to be going. And so it's considering things like your demand-driven meetings, your supply, your product marketing teams, and your financial evaluation. But I can either consider a vision by Oliver White. And for those who don't know, Oliver White were the people that first came up with the term, well, the actual person, Oliver White, came up with the term sales and operation planning, and Oliver White himself came up with the term integrated business planning. Now, Oliver White's vision of this process is that you have an integrated business planning looking at 36 months out. You also then have a integrated tactical planning, which is looking more current to, say, 3 months out, and then a scheduling and execution phase. But there's also then the concept where Gartner comes up with their core model, which is then essentially to configure the C, optimize, the respond, and the execute, which is essentially this model. They originally came up with a term called SCORE, but that was too confusing, so they changed it to CORE. But essentially, it doesn't really matter what you name these. It's essentially what you're doing in this. It's viewing your business from a strategic perspective. Doing a sales and operation planning process is more in a tactical perspective, which is more short-term, 3 months out to 12 months out, 24 months out. But the focus is around the 3-month period. And then there's also the sales and operations execution phase, and this term has been around a long time. It's been used by many other vendors and analysts, which is really around taking that strategic view down to your tactical view, and then down to your operational view, so the execution. And then the final stage, which is again what I mentioned previously, is around this monitor and adjust phase, which is essentially using modern technologies like Internet of Things, AI, to help you with the automation of that process. And essentially, Oliver White themselves say that when it comes to integrated business planning, there are various levels of maturity in this phase, and the final phase of that maturity is around that automation phase, where we are using technologies like Internet of Things. Okay, so I'm Oracle, so you probably wondered, why am I not talking about products just yet? So I saved that for the next slide. So just another view of what I was just mentioning, which is around the plan phase, integrated business planning, sales and operation planning, the execution, and then there's monitor and adjust. But what products? So what does the bill of material look like? So we can see that from top down we've got plan to execute, and then from the bottom up, monitor and adjust. But in terms of the actual products, what are we talking about? We're talking about, from a financial perspective, EPM planning, Enterprise Performance Management Planning. So this is where you're doing all of your financial planning. So your income statement, balance sheet, your P&L. We're talking about capital planning. We're talking about project planning, and then also workforce planning. So when you run your supply chain, you actually need to have the physical capacity, supply capacity, but you also need to have your actual people in terms of how can I plan for that. So that is on the EPM side. But then we also have on the supply chain planning side, and this is where, and not to be confused with sales and operation planning, we have a module called sales and operation planning, which is around coming up with the consensus plan, using a standard or a flexible way to organize your sales and operation planning to come to a consensus, doing rough cut capacity planning, optimizing to cost, that sort of thing. But then also the demand and supply planning elements of that. So using segmentation, using Bayesian methodology to come up with a single forecast that's statistically generated, not using concepts called best fit, where we take a big basket of forecasting algorithms. We're using a blended model to come up with the best possible forecast that you can run on. And then also the link back from, once we've done our sales and operation planning, coming up to that consensus number, feeding that number back to EPM, but also the link from our financial planning. Our financial planning is done at an aggregate level. So we're not talking about planning at item level, talking about planning at product category level, but taking that product category plan at a monthly level and breaking it down to what is my actual financial demand or my financial plan, looking at it an item at a customer organization level, down to weekly buckets that I can actually execute on. So that's the key. And then taking that and taking my plan, my demand, and generating the actual plan that the factories are going to be running on, generating the planned orders, using constrained planning to actually understand my capacity, generate my planned orders, my production orders, my replenishment orders. And then, of course, the last phase, which is the bottom, is the Internet of Things. So in here, we have a lot of power where we can actually use Internet of Things, digital twin, to actually predict when a machine can potentially fail, and then have the system advise you during your planning process of that this particular resource has an X percentage of failure rate, and then potentially being able to not only maintain that when you should, but also potentially change the capacity to move to other resources. Okay, so if we talk about the various stages of integrated business planning and that whole execution portion that I was mentioning, there are various stages. Now, again, I know it can be confusing, but it depends on how you are viewing this particular process. So sales and operation planning can be seen as part of the process, but it can also be seen as a maturity stage in your process. So initially, when we start with sales and operation planning, it could be that you are not ready to do full integrated business planning. You are not ready for that stage just yet. You are only ready really to maybe look at a tactical level, a few months out, balancing supply and demand, but not really integrating it with your financials, with your financial planning. And again, here, different companies evolve at different stages. So it could be that the financials team is much more mature than the supply chain, or vice versa. So sales and operation planning is more tactical, more around balancing supply and demand, When we talk about integrated business planning, this is where we are more strategic, focused more on risk management, more on long-term capacity planning, linking your team. And again, this could be a maturity process itself. So integrated business planning can have a start and an end where you are evolving over time. So we're talking about, do we have a separate financial planning process, or is integrated business planning the same process where it's all now linked? And then the final stage, which is what we term the integrated business planning and execution, is where you're now taking your linking that whole process down to execution. And just out of interest, when we've been positioning this solution, a lot of companies are talking now about, very interesting, but I've got a backlog right now. Can you help me with that? This is where we talk about the execution portion. So, and again, we can start there, and we can get to a point where you can evolve. You can start with finance. Now, with backlog management is as the orders coming in. I've got a backlog. I know about the backlog, but how can I optimize who gets what stock? So that I can recover, get to a point where I can recover and still keep my customers happy, because you don't want to have a situation where you're holding stock for someone and now you don't give it to anyone because you're now holding it for that one. So those are key challenges that we need to be addressing. So just one last slide just before I go is you know, who is using this software. So one of our big clients is Juniper Networks. So Juniper Networks is, if you don't know them, they make network security routers, network management software. I know they have a presence in the Netherlands. They're not probably one of the biggest ones, but I know they have an office in Amsterdam. I know they have an office in Belgium. So one of their challenges is that they were a SAP customer, but their big challenge is they didn't have the right visibility, supply chain visibility. They couldn't manage their stock. They had through acquisition had acquired a number of companies and all different systems. So that was one of their big challenges, and they implemented our supply chain planning software. And as a result, you can see some significant benefits in terms of reduction in inventory and 350%, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 350% return on investment. And yeah, they knew that they fortunately were able to implement this just before COVID hit, so they were able to react quite quickly to the massive spike in demand they had with everyone working from home, which, yeah, this is a very, very different setup from what we are used to. We're used to all presenting with our shorts and a jacket. Now doing this on stage is a bit different. But yeah, they faced the same challenge. Everyone was working from home, massive increase in demand in network, and they were able to react and resolve that using the software. So that is all. Thank you very much.